Hello Year 11 and welcome to your penultimate walking talking mock for our study skills week. Now in the last walking talking mock for the paper 2 modern text and poetry paper, we looked at the unseen question and we looked at the 24 marker. We looked at that first one, and one of the reasons why we did that is because for this question, there's aside from revising techniques and practicing unseen questions, the knowledge comes from actually all the other work that you've done in the poems and the literature in general and the ideas that you can gather. Now today we're kind of working backwards from the back. So today we're going to be looking at the power and conflict question. And then your last one is going to be the animal farm question. Now, one of the things that I'm kind of showing you ultimately is that you don't have to do, again, the literature papers in order. Maybe you want to start with your strengths. If you find animal farm, that is your easiest, you go for that one straight away. Or if you think, I'm going to do the unseen poetry, I know that I can do unseen because it's not a poem that I had to revise. And there's not a specific order that you have to do this. So, as you can see, we've done the unseen, that one question there. Now we're going to go to the power and conflict. And as you can see again, I'm always in the contents page just to make sure that I am not going to the wrong page. So I go to power and conflict. It says here, question 26, and it tells me to go to page 20. So that makes it dead easy. I'm not going to get confused about anything else. I'm going to go straight to page 20, okay? And that just ensures that I'm on the right question. Remember, there is another cluster, and we haven't done that. So we need to make sure that we go to the power and conflict, page 20. Now, the question is on page 20, as you can see, is there. However, one of the things I do recommend, just to give you a bit of a memory of the poems, double checking that you're on the right section of the paper, is just have a quick look at the poems that gets mentioned before the poem that gets mentioned in the question. And I can see Ozymandias, I can see London, I can see Remains, War Photographer, Kamikaze. Yes, this is definitely the cluster that I am writing. Now, before I kind of read the poem, even though I feel like for this question, if you've done really good revision, you shouldn't necessarily have to read the poem. You kind of know what you want to analyze. You know that straight away you want to go to the ideas. So actually, to succeed in the poetry comparison, the main thing that you want to be doing between the exam, between today and the exam, is making sure that you know poems really, really well. Now, if before the mock you feel that you haven't got time to really consolidate 15 poems, try and make sure that you at least try to remember 6 poems really, really well. Because what that means is, if whatever poem gets mentioned and you're a bit like, oh, I don't know much about that poem, at least you will have the poem in front of you and then you can analyze it, and then you will have another poem that you will know really, really well. So let's have a look at the question. And one of the things that hopefully you'll notice is that for this question is very similar, I think, to paper 2 question 4. They're asking you to do the same thing. So let's have a look. So it says, compare how poets present the ways that people are affected by war in War Photographer and one other poem of your choice. So let's highlight the keywords. So the first thing that it says is compare. Okay, so we need to make sure that we are comparing. So I usually, whenever I have compare, I always put a C. You know, like a bit like C, right? C. I need to make sure that I'm making those comparisons. Now, when you've got the how, okay, when you've got the how, is again, we've seen the how several times. That is to do with language. So I'm just going to put T, technique, analysis. Poets present the ways that people are affected by war. So the ways that people are affected by war. Okay, so I've got that idea there. Now, because I've got this idea here, that means that I need to make sure that I'm making a point, and then I'm using evidence to support that. Can you see? and then in War Photographer, and one other poem of your From Power and Conflict. So that ultimately is kind of you're writing a petal paragraph really, and then you're making that comparison to another poem, and then you do in petal. So I think you need to remember that petal is just a reminder that you need to do the assessment objectives. The point and the evidence is your AO1. So you're answering the question, you're giving evidence, and your T and your A is your AO2. You're analysing language, okay, technique analysis, and then your last bit is your AO3, and making those links back to the question, back to the context. So question 4, again, like you could use C right as well. It's just remember you must make sure that you remember that you should compare. Now the next thing that I look actually at is the focus of the question, because sometimes the focus of the question might have the words power, sometimes the focus of the question may have the word conflict, or sometimes it might be a bit specific like this one, the ways that people are affected by conflict. Now, whenever I see things to do with being affected by war or by conflict, I always think that like war affects us both psychologically and physically. So when I'm writing my ideas or the poems that I choose might be to discuss this psychological mental effect effect of war, and then that physical, because you always have violence and so forth. Now, because it's a war, it says war, that does restrict actually maybe some of the poems that you can't write about. So I would say you probably wouldn't necessarily maybe write about the preludes for this one, or I would say you wouldn't really write about My Last Duchess. There's an element of a internal conflict or a societal conflict in My Last Duchess and in the prelude, but it's not specifically war. So I would say that there are certain poems that I would definitely avoid for this question. Now, interestingly, in the exam, or in this version of the exam, they've given you the poem War Photographer. So that straight away, in by thinking about this poem, they've given me a poem where we've got an outsider. Ultimately, it's not a soldier to war. So you've got a poem where it is not a soldier. So when I'm thinking about the possible poems that I could compare War Photographer to in terms of the effects of war, I might think of other poems where I've got outsiders that are affected by war, so that they are not necessarily soldiers. And poems that come to mind for that are, for example, Poppies. You've got the mother who is sending her son to war, and ultimately the way that war and the excitement of war and the propaganda of war has taken her son away from her, and that this has had a psychological and emotional impact on her. But then the other one that I kind of think a tiny bit that maybe people might not think about it straight away is the emigre. The emigre is about somebody that has been forced to physically leave their country because of conflict, because of war. And they leave the country when they're very young. And then it is revealed later on in the poem that time rolls its tanks, so that conflict is affecting her original country and she can never ultimately go back. The other way that I could also compare the poem, War Photographer, is maybe think about poems where you've got insiders in war, insiders. And I suppose poems that have got insiders, what I mean by that is soldiers. Okay, so you might want to be thinking about the fact that you've got soldiers that ultimately they experience both that psychological and that physical impact of war. So I'm thinking of poems like Exposure. I like that poem in particular because it emphasizes the both the physical aspect of war, as they can hear the bullets and they're in the snow and the weather is awful. But also, you've got that psychological trauma from war. Um, the other poem that I'm thinking about here as well, that is a bit different because I mean, Exposure, you've got one person, so, well, no, you've got a group of soldiers in the trench, but it's quite negative about war. The other one that you might could compare it to is maybe even things like Charge of the Light Brigade. In terms of, again, that poem looks in particular at glorifying war, whilst Duffy seems to be criticizing war because it goes beyond the battlefield. So that could be maybe an idea that you can um, explore. I'm really aware that I could go through all the poems and ways that you could compare it. The main thing that you want to do on the day really is I'm thinking which poem do I feel that I could compare best to War Photographer. And personally, I am torn between Exposure and the Emigre, and I'm actually leaning towards comparing it to the Emigre, because in my head I've got this idea that's forming about the way that both Duffy, and then I can quickly check if I forgot who's written the Emigre. I can go to that list of poems here, and I'm thinking, where is she? Rumens, the Emigre. So I'm going to go for that one. Um, they both are exploring how people are affected by war, and how this has a long kind of impact on them, on individuals, even after they've left the conflict. I'm thinking about War Photographer. When he's back home, he's haunted by that trauma, and the emigre has is haunted by the trauma of war, um, but also is having to reshape her identity. So I'm kind of that's kind of where I'm thinking about going with my idea. So one of the things that I would do, and this is why I think it's very similar um, to paper two, question four, is again I would draw that hanger. And one of the lovely things about the poetry or the power and conflict comparison is that it's always good to really start with a similarity and then explore how they're really different. So I'm going to go for War Photographer and the Emigre. So I'm going to put here WP, that's for War Photographer, and then I'm just going to write E for the Emigre. And in the middle, I'm going to join them how they're connected. And then on the sides, I'm going to try and get my ideas. Now, ideally, you want to write at least two different comparisons. So always try to plan three. And then hopefully you are left with quite a few ideas. So let's start with my first comparison. So I've got War Photographer. I know the Emigre quite well. Off the top of my head, but just in case, let's see. I remember to bring an anthology. This one may have a few notes, but not many. Okay, so I'm gonna quickly have a look. I'm gonna read both poems just for the sake of the walking talking mark. But it's not something that you would be able to do in the exam. You need to really know the second poem that you are going to analyze. So let's start with War Photographer. So War Photographer. In his dark room, he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he a priest, preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England, home again, to ordinary pain which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes. A half-formed ghost, he remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. So again, a lovely, lovely poem where you can see the psychological and ultimately the physical impact as well of war. So let's quickly read the emigre. The emigre. There once was a country. I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear, for it seems I never saw it in that November which, I am told, comes to the milder cities. The worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view. The bride-filled paperweight. It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I am branded by an impression of sunlight. The wide streets of the city, the graceful slopes glow even clearer as time rolls its tanks, and the frontiers rise between us, close like waves. That child's vocabulary I carried here, like a hollow doll, opens and spills a grammar. Soon I shall have every coloured molecule of it. It may by now be a lie, banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. It tastes of sunlight. I have no passport. There is no way back at all. But my city comes to me in its own white plane. It lies down in front of me, docile as paper. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls. They accuse me of absence. They circle me. They accuse me of being dark in their free city. My city hides behind me. They mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. Now, you need to remember that you're not going to have the second poem to be able to read and compare. The only thing you're going to have is the title. So one of the things I want to show you today is actually, if for whatever reason you're having a moment of total blankness and you forget everything, one of the things that you can do is actually use the titles to analyze. So I'm going to try and show you that a tiny bit today. Okay, so when I'm thinking about both poems, one of the main ideas that I have is that I feel that both Duffy and Rumans, so I'm going to put actually, because I like writing in terms of the poets more than the poems themselves. So Duffy and Rumans. I want to make sure that I'm always writing about the poets. Now I feel, and I'm going to write this kind of in the middle, that both of them are kind of writing about the way that individuals are affected by, let me just put it a bit closer so that you can see it. Individuals are affected by war long after having been exposed to the violence or the conflict. And I kind of thought of this idea because both in War Photographer and Rumors, actually both speakers are away now from the conflict. Now in Duffy, we've got a photographer, so I'm just photographer that is back home. And in the emigre, we have a speaker in a country where they probably are seeking asylum or are refugees. A speaker in a country where they are refugees. Okay. Now, once I've got this now becomes my main idea. So I need to make sure that I've got quotes and techniques, poetic techniques that I can analyze. However, if I'm having a day where I can't remember anything, I could actually already analyze the titles, and I think the titles could give me a bit of evidence to back up this idea. Now, so looking at War Photographer, I'm thinking about the title of War Photographer. And one of the things that makes me think about the fact that he's long affected after this is in particular thinking about the use of the word photographer. Because what photographer is suggesting is that this is a profession, and that the subject of the poem is actually quite distant and detached from the conflict. However, he still is experiencing the detrimental impact because he was exposed to it and he had to record it, because his duty as a photographer is to make sure that he takes pictures. Now, so if for whatever reason I'm having an awful day and I can, like, even reading the poem, all I can think is the title. Actually, I've got an idea just based on the word photographer. However, I do have the poem in front of me, and I like to always, again, look kind of at the beginning, and I am going to focus on the fact that it says, in his dark room, he's finally alone. Now, I'm going to develop my analysis of this based on that quote by saying that he is in his dark room. And I'm going to analyze this from a symbolic, metaphorical and symbolic perspective. The dark room being ultimately his mind and the way that he has been traumatized by the conflict. So ultimately he has been affected, even though he has left the area of conflict. Now, I need to make sure that I then say similarly or however, and it is very much a however for me, because even though both writers are looking at the way that being exposed to conflict stays with you for a very long time, in The Emigre is not so much about his profession. I'm going to talk about the title, the French title of the poem, Emigre. Immediately suggests an aspect of like a foreigner, a stranger, and ultimately somebody that has been exiled because of war. Sorry, it's not fitting in. Because of war. So that might be something that I really, really want to analyze. Now, one of the things that I always remember about this poem is the way that, and I might use it because in this one it talks about the dark room, the beginning. This poem starts with, there once was a country. There once was a country. Now, I really like this line because you can quite quickly go to a high level technique by talking to the illusion of the fairy tale genre. And the way that I'm going to analyze this line is by saying that ultimately, like before the conflict came, her land or her country was the perfect place for her to be in. And another line that I remember from The Emigre is this idea of time rolled its tanks suggesting that now her country, like by using the word tanks, we've got that idea of conflict. And then I really love the fact that she describes herself at the end as a shadow, showing, I think, that she has lost her sense of identity because of conflict. Now, this would be my first comparison. And if I wrote a really, really good answer for this, just by doing this, then ultimately, one I can do is if I've got time and I'll do another one, ideally you want to do at least two things like this, then you will be in a really, really good place. So let's start going, because just explaining it is taking a bit of time. And I think this is because you can go anywhere. There's so many ideas that you can actually write about. And I might encourage, like, if your teachers want to pause it now and give you a chance to discuss what would you compare it to before I go through a sample paragraph, do feel free to do so, and then we can write the paragraph. Okay, so I am now going to start my sample paragraph. So this is going to take some time because there is so much that I'm doing, but I need to make sure that I am also explaining it as I go along. Okay, so this is my sample paragraph. So let's see how long it takes me as I am reading. So I'm going to start with, I always like writing in terms of the poets. So I've got my plan here, and I'm going to make sure that I keep on going back to it. I like, rather than the poems, I like to write about what the poets are doing. And I think that gives you better marks. So in my introduction or my theses, really, I always put the poet's name and I answer the question. So I make sure that this bit, ways that people are affected by war, is right at the beginning of my answer. And I started like this. Both Rumans and Duffy with a capital F, explore the ways people are affected by war. Both poets suggest, sorry if you can hear my son singing. Both poets suggest that conflict continues to, now this is where I'm going to put kind of this idea long after having, like, after they've been exposed, long after being exposed to the violence. So that conflict continues to affect individuals long after these individuals are far away from the physical violence and conflict. So that is my overall idea. And then I show how I think they're doing it differently. So I would say Duffy feels, so Duffy feels that war is a traumatic force that haunts the subject of her poem. Now, the subject of her poem is the war photographer. So I'm going to say here, so the subject of her poem is the war photographer. Now, because I'm going to say how the poems are different, okay, so I started, whilst rumens feels that conflict has. Now I'm thinking about the fact, so in Duffy's poem, it's about the way that war is a traumatic force and that still haunts the individuals. Now I can say that that's quite similar, I suppose, in Rumens, but I want to like look at it from a different angle, and I want to talk about the way that Rumens feels that conflict. It's not just that it haunts you, but it also displaces you. It makes you feel that you no longer belong. So feels that conflict has displaced the speaker. Or rather than conflict, let's put war, because I'm now like, no, rather than conflict, sorry, let's put war. That war has displaced the speaker of her poem, and she's being forced to reshape her identity whilst living in a new country. Okay, so whilst Rumens feels that war has displaced. Now look at the way that I'm always answering the way that peoples are being affected by war. Okay, now I'm going to write my analysis of both poems, but in particular I'm going to focus on that kind of psychological trauma, and one is the psychological trauma that haunts them, and the other one that is psychological because you're having to change your identity. So that's an emotional kind of effect. So I do a tiny comparative again, and I do it like this. So both Duffy and Rumens explore the psychological effects of war. Now that is just a nice comparison. Now, as I was writing this, I actually was a bit cross with myself, and I will not record this video again. But one of the things I should have done as well is introduce the names of the poems. So even though I like writing always in terms of the poets, one of the things I would do at the beginning is both Rumens, comma, in the Emigre. Sorry about this, but let's add it. This is good in terms of thinking. And Duffy, comma, in war photographer. So then I'm introducing the poets and their poems, okay? And that's the only time that I have to write it, really, unless I'm writing it again later. But I've just realised that I've never mentioned the names of the poems. So I'm assuming almost like this examiner knows them. So I just need to make sure that I do introduce them in my beginning. So let's go back to my main paragraph. Both Duffy and Rumens explore the psychological effects of war. Duffy, so now I'm going to focus on doing a petal, but for Duffy explores how witnessing violence, witnessing violence and being in charge of recording human, sorry, I think my dog might bark in a second, human suffering has a detrimental psychological impact on an individual even when they have been physically removed. Not that they have been, when they are physically removed from the battlefield. Both Duffy Rumans explore the psychological effects of war. Duffy explores how witnessing violence and being in charge of recording human suffering has a detrimental psychological impact on an individual even when they are physically removed from the battlefield. So I think that there I'm making a really clear point. The key with poetry is really able to explain the ideas. So now I'm going to put the evidence. Now, because I want to analyze the title, my evidence and my techniques might come together. So I'm going to say the title, which is my evidence, the title introduces the profession and role of the subject of the poem. So that's kind of my evidence. The word, so I'm going to zoom in and start doing techniques. The word photographer creates an image of an observer and not of someone who is actively taking part in an activity. The word photographer creates a detached and distant tone, which is immediately contrasted going to lean on something a bit better, which is immediately contrasted by the first line in the poem in his dark. I have to turn the page. Just going to give it there for a second. So the word photographer creates a detached and distant tone, which is immediately contrasted by the first line in the poem, in his dark room he is finally alone. Now, look at the way that as I'm analysing this, I've done a technique, so the word photographer, I've done analysis, and look, I'm doing another technique, and I'm doing another analysis. So when you're doing petal, you want to do peta-ta-ta-ta, okay? So the more you analyze and the more you develop like more quotes within your analysis, the better. So because of this, I love this line. I think this line is absolutely fantastic because I think the dark room emphasizes actually that psychological trauma that has ultimately followed him all the way back home. So that's kind of what I'm going to write as my analysis. The use of the word dark, or you can say adjective actually, of the word dark symbolizes the psychological trauma that has followed the photographer home. The use of the word room, so I'm going to assume it now in room. Now when I think of room, I think of comfort, but here, because room I think is symbolizing the state of his mind, it actually suggests more that he is trapped. So I'm going to explain that. So the use of the word room creates this domestic setting, so a place where you should feel safe. However, because it symbolizes his state of mind, then actually it does the opposite. So the use of the word room should connote, so connote means suggest, so connote a place of safety. However, Duffy uses it to symbolize the inner turmoil the photographer is experiencing and how he feels trapped as his memory forces him to relive the traumas, the horrors he saw. And I put something like, this is emphasized through the fact that he is developing the images in the poem. Okay, So that is my really detailed analysis of war photographer just based on the title and then one line. And I've talked about Duffy. Duffy uses, I'm just kind of going through the word photographer immediately. So now I need to do the other poem. So if you notice, I have done links. I've linked it back to the question. I haven't mentioned anything contextually, and I could, but I don't feel like at the moment I want to. I might do something later on with the emigre, or maybe later on in my second paragraph with war photographer. Now, context is important with the poems, but you need to make sure that whenever you're mentioning context, it fits the ideas and it fits like the question. And if you feel that what you're gonna say is just added as a sticker, it's just not as good. It gives you some marks, but it's just not as good. And at the moment, aside from the fact that Duffy was friends with war photographer, I could actually write that. Let me just think. Fact that he's developing images in the poem. Duffy herself. Let's write that down then. Duffy herself was friends with two famous war photographers, and so understands their struggle. Not sure I fully like that, but it's gonna have to do today. So the next bit is I've done my petal for war photographer, so I have to do my petal now for the emigre. Now, because I'm talking about a difference, I'm going to start my paragraph. So I've got the emigre, and I might put here on the other hand. Now, I'm going to write this as if I am having an awful day and I've forgotten what the emigre is about. So I'm going to focus on the title. So on the other hand, Rumens focuses on the speaker's sense of having lost their identity because, so I explain why, because they had to leave their country because it was at war. Full stop. So that is me making that point. So I'm going to say, so Rumens having lost their identity because they had to leave their country because it was at war. Rumens explores, so I'm going to say how this physical displacement has ultimately affected like a sense of internal turmoil because the speaker has to reshape her identity. So Rumens explores how this physical displacement caused by war has led to the speaker of the poem having to redefine and reshape her identity. Now, very similar to what I did with Wolf Photographer. And my evidence is going to be part of the title. So the use, I'm going to focus on the title. The use of the French term, émigré. The use of the French term émigré immediately creates an image of someone who is foreign and suggests an outsider. Suggests an outsider. By labeling the speaker as an émigré rather than giving them a name, comma, rather than giving them a name, Rumans suggests that the speaker has lost their sense of identity. Now, one of the things that I want to say is the way that maybe Rumans challenges, actually, by presenting this, by making us feel sorry for the speaker of the poem because they've been affected by war. So I might say, and this would be, so that I've done actually there, my technique and my analysis. What I finish this with is I'll say something along the lines of Rumans. So I'm going to link it to society and the message that Rumans might be sending. So Rumans challenges our perceptions of how those who are forced to flee their countries because of war and have to settle somewhere new. Women's challenges are perceptions of how, not maybe ours, no, it's not my perception. So women's challenges societies, maybe, perceptions of how those who are forced to flee their countries because of war and have to settle somewhere new are stripped of their identity because of war. Okay, so something along the lines of that. Now, I wanted to not write, ultimately, I didn't write everything that I had planned for the émigré because I was thinking actually, if I was in the exam and I can only remember the title, because I've got that in the beginning, then I would only write about the title. However, if I can remember other quotes, I always write my quotes and then I zoom in. So I hope you found this one helpful. It is a bit longer. This is why I suggest that probably in the exam, you probably would spend maybe 50 minutes on this question and 45 minutes maybe on Animal Farm. I hope you found this helpful, and sorry it's been so long.